Hidden beneath the dirt and rigged to the smallest tripwires, explosives fundamentally changed the psychological landscape of World War II. Today, we are cataloguing the exact, verified landmines and booby traps that terrorize soldiers across every theatre of the conflict. Nazi Germany kicking off our list, we have the German S-Mine 35, universally known to Allied troops as the Bouncing Betty. This terrifying anti-personnel weapon was triggered by a hidden tripwire or a three-pronged pressure plate. Once activated, a small black powder charge launched the central canister roughly 3 feet into the air. It would then detonate exactly at waist height, spraying over 300 lethal steel ball bearings in all directions. The sheer unavoidable lethality of this aerial blast made it the most feared landmine of the entire war. Its devastating effectiveness forced every major military power to immediately scramble and copy its bouncing design. Next we have the German Schü-mine 42, widely referred to as the wooden box mine. Designed to circumvent the massive Allied advantage in electronic metal detectors, this weapon was constructed almost entirely of cheap wood. It contained roughly a half-pound of cast TNT and utilized a Bakelite plastic fuse to minimize any metallic signature. When a soldier stepped on the hinged wooden lid, the downward pressure crushed the internal fuse and triggered the blast. Because it contained relatively little explosive, it was specifically designed to blow off a foot rather than kill the victim outright. This cruel tactical doctrine was intended to permanently drain Allied medical resources and severely demoralize advancing infantry units. Let us continue with the German Landmine 43, another highly notorious non-metallic explosive device. As steel resources became desperately scarce late in the war, German engineers turned to heavy glass to case their anti-personnel mines. The thick glass bowl contained a standard explosive charge and was topped with a fragile, easily shattered glass shear plate. Not only was it completely invisible to Allied minesweepers, but the explosion drove jagged glass shards deep into the victim's flesh. Because glass does not show up on standard medical X-ray machines, field surgeons found it nearly impossible to safely treat the wounded. It stands as a chilling testament to the desperate and brutal engineering of the collapsing Third Reich. Moving right along, we examine the German Stockmine, which was a concrete fragmentation stake mine. This crude but effective weapon consisted of a cylindrical concrete head poured around a small central explosive charge. The concrete was heavily mixed with scrap metal, gravel, and steel ball bearings to create devastating shrapnel upon detonation. The entire heavy head was mounted on a short wooden stake driven into the ground, perfectly elevating the blast above low vegetation. It was typically rigged with a tripwire strung across narrow woodland paths or hidden carefully within dense European hedgerows. Because it required very little steel to manufacture, the German military deployed millions of these static traps to slow the Allied advance. Next on our breakdown is the German Landmine 43, arguably the most recognizable anti-tank mine in military history. Nicknamed the Mushroom Mine due to its large domed circular shape, it was packed with 12 pounds of high explosives. It required roughly 300 pounds of downward pressure to detonate, meaning a lone infantryman could usually walk right over it safely. However, the heavy steel tracks of an advancing Allied Sherman tank would instantly crush the fuse and trigger a massive track-shattering explosion. Millions of these flat metal discs were buried along the Atlantic Wall and throughout the vast deserts of North Africa. The design was so perfectly engineered and reliable that it effectively set the standard for modern anti-tank warfare. Let us look at the German Landmine 43, also known simply as the steel bar mine. Unlike the circular Landmine, this explosive was housed in a long rectangular steel casing that measured over 2 feet in length. The elongated shape made it significantly harder for Allied tanks to accidentally drive past it without a track hitting the pressure plate. It contained 8 pounds of TNT and could be triggered by pressure applied anywhere along its heavy top lid. German combat engineers often laid these long mines end-to-end across narrow dirt roads to create completely impassable mechanical barriers. Because it featured multiple anti-handling fuse ports, attempting to defuse this long bar was an incredibly deadly task for Allied sappers. Continuing our catalogue, we have the German Zugzünder 35, the standard fuse used for booby traps. This highly versatile, mechanically simple device was the dark heart of thousands of deadly traps rigged across the European theatre. It consisted of a brass or steel cylinder containing a spring-loaded striker held carefully in place by a prominent release pin. German soldiers would tie a nearly invisible tripwire to the pin and connect the fuse directly to a concealed block of explosives. When an unwary Allied soldier snagged the wire, the pin was pulled free, releasing the striker and detonating the hidden charge instantly. This tiny device allowed retreating German forces to turn ordinary doors, abandoned weapons, and even dead bodies into lethal surprises. United States of America. Transitioning to the United States, we start with the M2 bouncing anti-personnel mine. After suffering horrific casualties from the German-bounding mines, the American military quickly reverse-engineered their own deadly version. It utilized a small, mortar-like steel tube planted securely in the ground and connected to a hidden tripwire mechanism. Upon activation, a propellant charge violently ejected the explosive shell roughly 6 feet into the air before the main fuse triggered. The resulting airborne detonation rained lethal, jagged cast-iron shrapnel down upon any advancing enemy infantry squads caught in the open. This terrifying weapon was heavily utilized by American forces to protect vulnerable artillery positions and command posts from sudden nighttime ambushes. Next, we have the United States M3 cast-iron anti-personnel fragmentation mine. This was a heavy, square block of cast iron that looked remarkably similar to a large industrial brick. The thick iron casing was designed to shatter into large, highly lethal chunks, traveling at immense speeds upon detonation. It contained nearly a pound of flaked TNT and was typically triggered by a standard pull or pressure booby trap fuse. Because of its awkward, heavy shape, it was not usually buried in the dirt like a traditional pressure mine. Instead, American combat engineers would wire these heavy iron blocks to trees or wooden posts alongside roads to shred passing German patrols. Let us continue with the United States M1A1 heavy anti-tank mine. This was the primary defensive explosive utilized by American combat engineers to halt massive German armored counterattacks. It was constructed from heavy stamped steel and packed to the brim with almost 6 pounds of highly stable TNT. The distinctive spider-like pressure plate on top required heavy vehicular weight to crush the internal chemical fuse and trigger the blast. Engineers typically buried them in perfectly staggered rows across vital roads and strategic choke points to create impassable, lethal kill zones. It was an incredibly reliable, heavy-hitting weapon that successfully disabled thousands of Axis transport vehicles and tanks throughout the war. Moving right along, we examine the United States M7 light anti-tank mine. This small rectangular explosive was developed as a lightweight alternative that could be easily carried in large numbers by standard infantrymen. It contained roughly 3.5 pounds of Tetraethyl explosive, which was enough to blow the track off a medium tank. The casing was incredibly simple, featuring a sliding top plate that would press down onto a standardized chemical crush fuse. Because it was so light, troops often used them as improvised satchel charges to destroy concrete bunkers or fortified roadblocks. While it lacked the massive destructive power of heavier mines, its portability made it highly popular among advancing frontline troops. Next on our list is the United States M1 booby trap firing device. This was the standard issue pull mechanism issued to American forces for creating improvised traps behind enemy lines. It was a compact, spring-loaded tube that could be easily taped or wired to a block of demolition explosives. A soldier would carefully attach a tripwire to the release pin and stretch it across a doorway, staircase, or jungle trail. When the wire was disturbed, the spring drove the firing pin directly into a percussion cap, instantly setting off the explosive charge. It was an essential tool for infantry squads needing to secure their rear flanks against sudden Japanese banzai charges in the Pacific. Great Britain and Commonwealth forces. Shifting to Great Britain and Commonwealth forces, we start with the anti-personnel mine Mark II. This simple, effective weapon was widely utilized by British forces during the massive desert campaigns of North Africa. It consisted of a small cylindrical metal tin containing a central explosive charge surrounded by heavy steel shrapnel rings. A sensitive pressure plate rested on the top, requiring only a few pounds of force from a soldier's boot to trigger the fuse. When detonated, the fragmented steel rings expanded outward at lethal speeds, easily cutting down any infantry caught within the blast radius. It was cheap to produce and was frequently buried in massive, sweeping minefields to protect British defensive lines from Italian and German assaults. Next, we look at the British anti-tank mine General Service Mark V. This circular steel mine was a massive upgrade to the British arsenal and became the standard anti-tank explosive of their armoured divisions. It contained roughly 4.5 pounds of high explosives, encased in a durable tin plate body, designed to survive harsh climates. The central pressure plate featured a distinct spiderweb design that directed the crushing weight of a vehicle directly onto the fuse. It was highly effective at shattering the tracks of the legendary German panzer tanks rolling across the vast, open deserts of North Africa. Engineers often stacked two of these mines directly on top of each other to ensure the complete destruction of heavier Tiger tanks. Let us examine the British anti-tank mine number 75, universally famous as the Hawkins grenade. This flat, rectangular flask of explosives was the absolute favourite anti-vehicular weapon of the Allied airborne forces dropping into Normandy. It was incredibly versatile, allowing a tracked paratrooper to throw it like a heavy satchel charge or bury it quietly in the dirt. When utilised as a static mine, a chemical crush igniter was placed on the top plate to detonate under the weight of tank treads. Because it was relatively lightweight, paratroopers could carry several of these powerful flasks in their jump bags during the massive aerial invasion. It provided isolated, outgunned infantry squads with a desperately needed, devastatingly effective defence against sudden armoured patrols. Continuing our catalogue, we have the highly specialised British L-delay switch, commonly known as the time pencil. While not a traditional landmine, this was the most notorious standardized booby trap device issued to resistance fighters and elite saboteurs. It was a small copper tube containing a glass vial of corrosive acid and a heavy, spring-loaded striker mechanism. When the operative crushed the vial, the acid slowly ate through a retaining wire until it finally snapped and triggered the explosive. By utilizing different thicknesses of internal wire, the detonation delay could be perfectly timed from a few hours to several weeks. This ingenious, stealthy device was used to secretly blow up countless German supply trains, fuel dumps, and occupied bridges across Europe. Next up is the British switch number 6, which was a dedicated release mechanism for booby traps. This small spring-loaded device was specifically engineered to trigger an explosive when a heavy weight was lifted off of it. British combat engineers frequently utilized this switch as a deadly anti-handling device placed securely underneath standard anti-tank mines. When a German sapper carefully located the main mine and attempted to lift it out of the dirt, the hidden switch was released. The sudden release of downward pressure instantly fired the internal striker, detonating a hidden secondary explosive charge and killing the bomb disposal expert. It was a cruel, highly psychological weapon, designed to paralyze enemy engineering efforts and slow down entire armored columns. Soviet Union. Transitioning to the Soviet Union, we start with the WWII stake-mounted fragmentation mine. Because the Soviet Union lacked sophisticated precision manufacturing early in the war, this weapon was brilliantly designed to be built in local village workshops. It consisted of a cast-iron pineapple-style sleeve that was simply slid over a wooden stake driven firmly into the dirt. A soldier would place a small block of TNT inside the sleeve and attach a tripwire tightly across a heavily wooded path. When a German patrol snapped the hidden wire, the iron casing instantly shattered into dozens of lethal, flying metal chunks. Its brutal simplicity allowed the desperately retreating Red Army to manufacture millions of them, to bleed the advancing Nazi war machine. Next, we have the Soviet PMD-6 wooden box anti-personnel mine. Much like the German wooden mine, this device was created out of sheer desperation and a severe lack of industrial steel. It was a crude, hinged wooden box that contained a standard block of explosive and a simple, pressure-sensitive firing pin. Because it was made almost entirely of wood, it completely bypassed the standard electronic metal detectors utilized by the invading Axis armies. They were incredibly cheap to mass produce, but the untreated wood frequently warped and rotted in the freezing mud of the Eastern Front. Despite its flaws, it successfully claimed thousands of casualties and became a terrifying staple of the brutal winter warfare in Russia. Let us continue with the Soviet M1A1 bouncing mine. This was an absolutely massive, terrifyingly destructive anti-personnel weapon created by repurposing heavy artillery shells. Soviet engineers took standard 152mm high explosive shells and buried them nose-deep in the frozen ground. A specialized expelling charge was rigged to a tripwire, which would launch the massive heavy steel shell a few feet into the air. The resulting aerial detonation was completely catastrophic, capable of completely wiping out an entire platoon of advancing German infantry in a single blast. Because it utilized pre-existing heavy artillery ammunition, it offered unparalleled explosive yield for a static perimeter defense weapon. Moving right along, we examine the Soviet TM-41 anti-tank mine. This circular steel mine was heavily inspired by captured German designs and served as the backbone of Soviet anti-armor defenses. It contained nearly 9 pounds of a specialized explosive mixture called amato, which was incredibly powerful and relatively cheap to produce. The top of the mine featured a large ridge pressure plate that required the heavy weight of a panzer to crush the internal fuse. Soviet combat engineers were legendary for planting these mines at night, crawling thousands of yards across no man's land to mine German tank routes. The TM-41 successfully destroyed thousands of Axis vehicles during the titanic armored clashes at the Battle of Kursk. Next on our breakdown is the Soviet MUV fuzes. This was the absolute most common booby trap mechanism utilized by the Red Army throughout the entire duration of the conflict. It was an incredibly simple, bare metal tube containing a spring and a striker held back by a small metal pull ring. Soviet soldiers famously screwed this fuse directly into the top of their standard F1 fragmentation grenades to create instant, deadly tripwire traps. They would tie thin wire across trench lines, doorways, and abandoned equipment, turning the ruins of Stalingrad into a massive, lethal maze. Its crude but flawless reliability made it a terrifyingly effective tool for the brutal close-quarters urban warfare of the Eastern Front. Empire of Japan. Shifting to the Empire of Japan, we start with the Type 93 anti-tank mine. This circular disc-shaped mine was the primary anti-vehicular explosive utilized by the Imperial Japanese Army across the Pacific and Asian theaters. It contained a relatively small explosive charge of roughly 2 pounds, making it surprisingly weak compared to its massive American and European counterparts. Because American Sherman tanks were heavily armored, a single Type 93 was often completely insufficient to cause any meaningful track damage. To solve this, Japanese defenders frequently stacked 3 or 4 of these mines on top of each other in the dirt to multiply the explosive yield. It featured a simple brass fuse with a shear wire that would snap under the heavy crushing weight of an advancing vehicle. Next, we look at the Japanese Type 3 wooden anti-tank mine. As the American island hopping campaign effectively destroyed Japanese industrial supply lines, the military was forced to abandon steel casings entirely. This desperate weapon consisted of a simple wooden box sealed with tar to protect the internal explosives from the intense tropical moisture. It utilized a heavy, rudimentary friction fuse that required massive pressure to ignite the black powder train and detonate the main charge. Because it contained no metal parts, it was completely invisible to American minesweepers tearing the beaches of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. However, the extreme humidity of the jungle often ruined the firing mechanism, leading to a massive failure rate during actual combat operations. Let us examine the Japanese Type 99 magnetic armor-piercing mine. This highly unique weapon was designed to be manually attached directly to enemy tanks by daring Japanese infantrymen. It featured 4 powerful magnets placed around the edge of a canvas cover that held the explosive-shaped charge inside. A soldier would sprint up to an American Sherman tank, slap the mine against the steel hull, and immediately strike the fuse. The resulting directed blast could punch completely through heavy steel plate, instantly incapacitating the armored vehicle and its crew. This suicidal close-quarters tactic was a terrifying hallmark of the desperate defensive battles fought in the final years of the Pacific War. Continuing our catalogue, we have the Japanese Type 99 grenade. Rather than manufacturing complex, dedicated booby traps, the Imperial Japanese Army ingeniously improvised with this standard-issue infantry equipment. The Type 99 featured a unique friction fuse that could be easily modified by a clever, desperate soldier in the field. Defenders would pull the safety pin, tie a tripwire directly to the fuse, and hide the explosives perfectly along a dense jungle trail. When an advancing American Marine tripped the hidden wire, the grenade detonated almost instantly, causing horrific and fatal shrapnel injuries. This terrifyingly simple, improvised tactic made every single step in the dense, claustrophobic Pacific jungles a potential death sentence. Kingdom of Italy. Transitioning to the Kingdom of Italy, we start with the B2 anti-personnel mine. This was a relatively small, lightweight explosive device, utilized heavily by Italian forces defending the mountainous passes of Greece and North Africa. It featured a distinct cylindrical metal casing containing a small but highly effective fragmentation charge designed to maim advancing infantry. The top of the mine utilized a very sensitive pressure switch, requiring only a careless footstep from an Allied soldier to trigger the blast. Italian combat engineers often buried these small mines in dense, unpredictable clusters to completely deny the enemy access to strategic mountain roads. While not as famous as the German bounding mines, the B-2 was a reliable and constant threat to Allied patrols operating in the Mediterranean. Finally, wrapping up our comprehensive list, we have the Italian Type CS anti-tank mine. This large rectangular explosive was the primary defensive weapon used by Italian armoured divisions to protect their flanks in the open desert. It contained roughly 8 pounds of cast TNT and featured a prominent, elongated pressure plate stretching across the top of the casing. The rectangular design was intended to increase the surface area, making it significantly harder for a British tank to accidentally drive past the trigger. It was a sturdy, well-engineered weapon that performed reliably in the scorching heat and abrasive sand of the Libyan desert. Countless British cruiser tanks fell victim to these heavy mines during the massive, sweeping armoured engagements of the North African campaign.